Welcome back to Living Pardes. As I was contemplating the idea of creating a video about the 70 weeks of Daniel, and though I have come to several understandings about the 70 weeks, I find one issue that keeps arising that will be a continual hindrance to understanding Daniel's prophecies, as well as other prophetic interpretations. This is the grand misconception that surrounds the birth year and date of Yeshua, or Jesus. So in order to come to a more complete understanding of prophecy and to put to rest the arguments of naysaying secular historians, I will attempt to demonstrate a more logical and thorough argument for when Yeshua was born, while straightening out the inaccurate perceptions of contradictions. In order to do this thoroughly, we will be comparing the scriptures with the historical records, along with the most ancient traditions. Once we have finished, we should have a more clear and definitive argument for when Yeshua was actually born, minus all of the hindering misconceptions. First, we will consider some scriptures within the New Testament that can provide a reference point of his birth. In this process, we will see if we can work to make straight the misconceptions around these verses. The first and most obvious verse can be found in the birth narrative in the Gospel of Luke. It states in Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, "Now in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all the inhabited earth. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all the people were on their way to register for the census, each to his own city." This one scripture has caused many issues for theologians through the years. It has also provided an inaccurate perception of a contradiction that has led many atheists and anti-Christians to argue that it proves that the scriptures are not inspired by the divine. This contradiction arises from two different scriptures that apparently create a logical fallacy, or two statements that cannot be true at the same time. Here is the problem. It states in Matthew 2, verse 1, "Now after Yeshua was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem." According to traditional historians, Herod the Great, as spoken about in Matthew 2:1, died in or before 4 BCE. On the other hand, as Luke 2:1 through 3 states, that Yeshua was born around the time of the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. According to traditional historians, Quirinius did not govern Syria until 6 CE. The argument that the scriptures are not inspired arises in the idea that Yeshua could not be born on or before 4 BCE, or the death of Herod the Great, because he was born when Quirinius was governor of Syria after 6 CE. Thus, one of the two statements must be false. If one of them is false or a lie, then the scriptures cannot be inspired by the divine, as the divine would not lie. So in order to find the truth, we must find out which premise of the argument is incorrect. The argument looks like this. Premise 1. Yeshua was born before 4 BCE because Herod the Great was still alive. Premise 2. Yeshua was born after 6 CE because he was born during the first census when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Premise 3. Two contradictory statements cannot both be true, so one of them must be false. Premise 4. Scriptures which are inspired by the divine cannot be false. Therefore, the scriptures must not be inspired by the divine. In order to agree with or overcome this argument, one must test the validity of each of the premises. For this reason, we will first consider premise 1 and try to understand if this premise is true. The basis of this premise is the idea that Yeshua was born during the lifetime of Herod the Great. According to Matthew, this reference to King Herod has to be Herod the Great, as it states later in Matthew 2:22 that his son, Herod Archelaus, became ruler of the region after his father. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, "Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. In this we find that it was in fact Herod the Great that was alive at the time of Yeshua's birth. Yet one must ask, why is it that people believe that Herod died in 4 BCE? If you read any history book written today, you will find overwhelming consensus that Herod the Great died in 4 BCE. Yet, as we have found in recent years, consensus does not always make things correct. How then do we know that King Herod died in 4 BCE? The basis for a 4 BCE death of King Herod is twofold and based on the writings of the ancient Jewish historian Josephus. The first can be found in Josephus' Antiquity of the Jews, where it states that King Herod died between an eclipse and the next Passover, following that eclipse. The second can also be found in Josephus' Antiquity of the Jews, which states that Herod's son Philip died in the 20th year of Tiberius' reign, and Philip reigned for 37 years total. Since the reign of Tiberius began in 14 AD, and Philip died in the 20th year of his reign, 14 plus 20 equals 34. Then we can assume that Philip died in 34 AD. Now to find when Herod died, all we need to do is subtract the length of Philip's reign from the year Philip died. 34 AD minus 37 years takes us to 3 BCE. This logic seems concise and irrefutable. Then when we consider the eclipses of around that time, we find that they can also confirm that time frame. History and astronomical models show that there were 4 eclipses that occurred around this time in history, which would mean that Herod would have died between the eclipse and the Passover following that eclipse in one of these years. The first was March 23rd, 5 BC, which was a total eclipse. The second was September 15th, 5 BC, which also was a total eclipse. The next was found to be March 13th, 4 BC. This was a partial eclipse. And the last one was January 10th, 1 BCE. This was a total eclipse. In this we find that according to modern historians, the eclipse of March 13th, 4 BCE fits in line with what modern historians believe. In other words, since it can be extrapolated from the works of Josephus that Herod died sometime before 3 BCE through the death of his son Philip, then the eclipse occurring before the Passover of 4 BCE further validates this belief. As such, according to the majority of modern secular historians, the death of Herod the Great occurring in 4 BCE has become fact. Yet, I would like to note that this is describing modern historians. We know that this belief in modern times was made mainstream through the works of Emil Scherer in his book History of the Jewish People in the Time of Jesus Christ. Note also that these arguments are based on the works of Flavius Josephus, written sometime before 100 CE, when it is believed that he died. If we ascribe as true that the times of the eclipses actually occurred as outlined, and the words of Josephus were true, that Herod died between the eclipse and the following Passover, then we must ask if the second argument is true, based on the reign of King Herod's son Philip. If we were to look at the modern translations of Flavius Josephus, we would find that Philip reigned for 37 years, which began right after his father's death. Modern editions of Josephus' Antiquities reads, "About this time it was that Philip, Herod's brother, departed this life in the 20th year of the reign of Tiberius, after he had been tetrarch of Trachonitis and Gaulonitis, and of the nation of the Bantaneans also 37 years. Note that this states that it was Herod's brother, and is likely speaking about Philip's brother Herod Antipas, or his other brother Herod Archelaus. However, when we begin to trace back the source of this writing in Josephus, we find something very interesting. We find that in 1798, in a dissertation written by a Franciscan monk, the monk claimed to have seen earlier versions of Josephus' Antiquities, in which the text read, the 22nd year of Tiberius. Though this was a mere footnote in history, no one ever took the time to look into this until 1966, when W.E. Filmer drew attention to this discrepancy in an article in the Journal of Theological Studies and pointed out the need to authenticate this claim. Yet, even with this note for authentication being needed, everyone still disregarded this notion and held to their belief that it said in the 20th year of Tiberius. It wasn't again until 1983 when David W. Beyer visited the British Library and uncovered evidence supporting this claim. Then in 1994, Beyer conducted further research in the U.S. Library of Congress and found the same discrepancy. In fact, he found that none of the writings of Josephus' Antiquities that were written prior to 1544 recorded the 20th year. All of them recorded the 22nd year. This means that an error occurred within this section of Josephus' Antiquities sometime before 1544, and that error had been reproduced the same way ever since that time. It should be noted that the world's first printing press was created around 1436, and the first printed edition of Josephus' Antiquities occurred in 1544. Prior to this time, his works were copied by hand through copyists. After 1544, every edition would remain the same, as it was able to be reproduced by the printing press. Therefore, we find the source of the modern problem. It is apparent that prior to the invention of the printing press, all other copies of Josephus' Antiquities stated that Philip died in the 22nd year of Tiberius. After that time, all modern copies have stated the 20th year of Tiberius. How does this affect our timeline? If we calculate this discrepancy, which is that Philip died in the 22nd year of Tiberius, then we would see that he died in 36 AD. In other words, since the reign of Tiberius began in 14 AD and Philip died in the 22nd year of his reign, 14 AD plus 22 years equals 36. Then we can assume that Philip died in 36 AD. When we calculate in the fact that Philip reigned 37 years after his father dies, then we see that 36 minus 37 equals 1 BCE, meaning that King Herod died in 1 BCE. If we then reconsider the list of eclipses that occurred at or around that time, we find that on January 10th, 1 BC, an eclipse occurred. This also occurred as a total eclipse, meaning that it would have been much more noticeable than a partial eclipse, like which occurred in 4 BCE, and more likely a reason why it was written about by Josephus. So what we find is that it is more likely that King Herod died sometime within the 12 and a half weeks between January 10th, 1 BC, and Passover that year. What is amazing to me is that after 1798, when a Franciscan monk pointed out the discrepancy, it took nearly 200 years for the validity of the claim to be sought out and validated. What amazes me even more is how this knowledge has not become mainstream, and until this very day, everyone is still claiming that Herod died in 4 BCE. If we return back to our initial premises, we find that premise 1 is incorrect. However, even if we correct the premise to show that King Herod died in 1 BCE, this does not alleviate the problem with Luke, which states that Yeshua was born during the first census while Quirinius was governor of Syria, if he became governor of Syria in 6 CE. Historically, some have attempted to refute this argument by basically stating that Luke knew things about Quirinius that has been lost to modern historians and theologians. They then argue that Quirinius was ruler of Syria on 2 separate occasions. They postulate that this first sentence may have taken place during his first term of governor of Syria. They point out that the Greek word translated as governor is a general word that could apply to another governing role held by Quirinius during the time when Herod was still alive, between 6 and 4 BC. They also point to an ancient stone fragment known as the Tivoli inscription, which was discovered in 1764 near Rome. The stone inscription mentions an unnamed Roman official who ruled Syria 2 times while under the rule of Augustus. For this reason, many scholars believe Quirinius was the official identified in the inscription. If this were so, the narrative found in Luke chapter 2 could possibly set in Quirinius' first term as governor, while Herod the Great was still alive. Yet, this has been seen as a flawed argument, as historians have pointed out that the inscription itself does not show that it is talking about Quirinius. And the period of time that they believed Quirinius would have needed to be governor of Syria was between 6 and 4 BCE. At this time of his life, he himself was very much occupied, having been assigned to a campaign in Cilicia in Asia Minor from 11 to 3 BCE. Roman records further indicate that Saturninus governed Syria from 9 to 6 BCE, and P. Quintilius Varus was governor from 6 to 4 BCE. Therefore, based on what we found to be the flawed idea that Yeshua was born before Herod's death in 4 BCE, then historians would believe themselves to be correct. However, if one were to consider the revised version of events, with Herod dying in 1 BCE, then the argument is less flawed. This is because, 1. Quirinius was participating in the campaign in Cilicia in Asia Minor from around 11 to 3 BCE, meaning that he could have theoretically been temporarily placed as governor of Syria sometime later from 3 BCE to 1 BCE. And 2, when P. Quintilius Varus' governorship ended until 1 CE, when Gaius Caesar became governor of Syria, historians have not been able to reliably place the person in the region as governor, though some believe it to have been Lucius Calpurnius Piso Cessonius. Lastly, since Cilicia is adjoined to Syria, and there is evidence that around 36 CE, the governor of Syria at that time, named Vitellius, dispatched troops from Syria to quell disturbances taking place in Cilicia, then it comes to reason that Syria and Cilicia were joined as one unit, being governed by one governor. If Quirinius finished his campaign in late 4 BCE through early 3 BCE, and Cilicia is later seen as one unit with Syria, then it is reasonable to believe that Quirinius took over governing responsibilities for both areas from 3 BCE to 1 BCE in the interim between P. Quintilius Varus and Gaius Caesar. This then could give us 2 separate occasions when he would have been governing the land of Syria, one after conquering its adjoined Cilicia, and later when he was officially made the governor in 6 AD. With the governor from the time period between 3 BCE and 1 BCE being in question, and knowing that Herod was alive until 1 BCE, it creates a possibility for the argument being true, that Quirinius was the unknown governor of Syria 2 times, thereby demonstrating that Yeshua could have been born during the life of Herod between 3 and 1 BCE, as well as while Quirinius was in the first term governing Syria. Yet, as noted, this is only a possibility based on an ancient stone tablet and knowing that he had conquered the land of Cilicia, which became joined as part of Syria. In another account from Josephus, he does write about another census occurring in 6 CE. However, he explicitly states that these people taxed were assessed of their possessions, including lands and livestock. In other words, the census takers were also the tax assessors. Through ancient Egyptian records, we find that these tax assessors went from house to house in order to perform their duties. With this in mind, we find another issue in Luke's narrative, as it has Joseph and Mary making a 3-day journey away from their home in Nazareth to register in their alleged ancestral home of Bethlehem. An ancient Egyptian papyrus recorded a census in 104 CE, and it explicitly stated that since registration by household is imminent, it is necessary to notify all who, for any reason, are absent from their districts to return to their own homes that they may carry out the ordinary business of registration. Luke describes Nazareth as their own city in Luke 2:39. Therefore, if the rules of this Egyptian census applied to Palestine, then Joseph and Mary should have stayed in Nazareth to be enrolled. They would not have left to go to Bethlehem. However, the fact that Josephus writes about the taxation census occurring in 6 CE also brings up another problem with the solution, namely that the taxation census did occur in 6 CE. Josephus wrote that Quirinius was sent into the region on the twofold mission to take the census and to secure the property of Archelaus at the time of his exile. Second, Josephus asserts an explicit date for the census in the 37th year from Caesar's defeat of Antony at Actium in 31 BC, that is, in 6 CE. So in this we find that a taxation likely did occur in 6 CE when Quirinius was sent to Syria-Palestine. In Greek, the word for taxation is the word apotimesis. But within the text of Luke, the Greek word apography, meaning enrollment or registration, was used. Apo meaning far from or away from, and grapho means write or sign, demonstrating that they were going there to sign or write something, registering for something, or enrolling in something. Furthermore, it states that at this time, the decree went out to the entire world from Caesar Augustus, namely the whole Roman world or the Roman Empire. This type of decree would not necessarily be required if it was only seeking the local taxation of Palestine, but rather it was a decree sent out into the whole Roman Empire. One must then ask, was there any census or enrollment that would have been a decree or edict of the entire Roman Empire prior to 6 CE? According to Roman historical documents, there was another census or enrollment that occurred within the time period that we are considering. In fact, this was a decree or edict that was sent out into the entire Roman Empire, where everyone would need to be enrolled and was not for taxation. According to Roman records, 2 BCE was one of the most important years in the career of Caesar Augustus. In 2 BCE, Augustus was turning 60 years old, and it was the silver jubilee of his rule, which had begun in 27 BCE. At the same time, it was also the 750th anniversary of the founding of Rome. As a result, on February 5th, 2 BCE, the Senate and the people of Rome were going to award Caesar Augustus the highest of all decorations, the father of the country, Pater Patrae. We know this first because on the coins of this period, it shows that they gave him this name starting in 2 BCE. The Roman celebrations during this year were greater than any before. The festivities and celebrations encompassed the entire Roman Empire, including the provinces. Augustus knew beforehand of this special honor and issued an edict or decree calling for an oath of loyalty to him to occur in 3 BCE for all of his Roman subjects. In 1899, a complete copy of this edict was found and was published in the ancient Roman statutes. This edict was clearly dated to 3 BCE and found in Paphlagonia, or what is now known as northern Turkey. A second partial copy of this edict was also found in Armenia. We find further proof of this decree in the works of Josephus in the Antiquities of the Jews. He wrote about this oath of loyalty, saying that it was a time when all the people of the Jews gave assurance of their goodwill to Caesar. It was also found that Augustus himself wrote about this in his diary, stating, "While I was administering my 13th consulship, the Senate and the Equestrian Order and the entire Roman people gave me the title, Father of my country." With this being noted, it is more likely that Joseph and Mary would have went to Bethlehem due to an enrollment during this oath of loyalty. Thus, it wasn't a census for taxation that brought Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem, but rather it was for the registration of their oath of loyalty to Caesar Augustus, which occurred in 3 BCE rather than 6 CE. In fact, since this registration occurred prior to February of 2 BCE, it is of great likelihood that this registration actually occurred in 3 BCE, when it was decreed that it was to occur, revealing a time period that is both a known decree to the whole world and during the revised lifetime of King Herod. When we return back to the original text, we still need to consider that it states, this registration first took place when Quirinius was governor of Syria. When looking at this sentence, we find that it could also read, this registration took place first when Quirinius was governing Syria. When read this way, it brings something to light, as the word first is crucial to the sentence. When looking at the Greek, we find that the word prote is used. This word comes from the word protos. In this sentence, it is used as the word first. However, this word can also be translated as before or forward. In this we find something that could change the whole understanding to this sentence. This means the sentence could be changed from, this registration took place first when Quirinius was governing Syria, to, this registration took place before Quirinius was governing Syria. When translated this way, it would point to an enrollment being taken before 6 CE, without the need for Quirinius to be governing Syria at the time. The one enrollment that we know of prior to Quirinius being governor of Syria occurred in 3 BC as an oath of loyalty to Caesar Augustus. With this being said, it seems apparent that any way you look at it, once you fix the death date of King Herod, the problem gets resolved. Either the 3 BCE enrollment of the oath of loyalty occurred, A, before Quirinius was governing Syria, or B, in the first term of Quirinius governing Syria after unifying Cilicia with Syria, or C, it was the first census while Quirinius was governing Syria after unifying Cilicia with Syria, making the second enrollment or taxation in 6 CE, which the history reveals. In any of these cases, we find strong evidence that Yeshua would have been born sometime within the year of 3 BCE. Yet, as you know, I cannot settle with just one set of scriptures demonstrating this. So a second scripture source is necessary to demonstrate a second witness to this truth. In the Gospel of John, we find that at the end of chapter 1, Yeshua is baptized by Yohanan, or John the Baptist. After this, he goes about gathering his disciples. Then in chapter 2, we find him at the wedding of Cana in Galilee. While there, he turns the water into wine, which is noted to be the first sign or miracle performed by him. This demonstrates that this is the very beginning of the ministry of Yeshua. Right after this, he then heads to Jerusalem and visits the temple. While there, in John 2:19, Yeshua states, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." In response to this, in John 2:20, it states, "The Jews said to him, 'For 46 years this temple has been being built, and you will raise it in 3 days?'" So in this we find that at the time Yeshua started his ministry, the temple had been in the process of being built for 46 years. Some versions of this scripture state that the temple was built or completed in 46 years. However, this translation would not be correct, as we know from the writings of Josephus and other ancient eyewitnesses, which state the building of the temple had begun in the 18th year of King Herod's reign, which is around 20 to 19 BCE. It was not completed until around 63 or 64 CE. Therefore, when Yeshua was alive and walking around, it was still in the process of being built, which can be supported by the text. We also know that in Luke 3:23 it states, Yeshua himself was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. With all of these facts, it is only a simple math calculation to figure out when Yeshua was born. If the temple was started around 20 to 19 BCE, and at the beginning of Yeshua's ministry, the temple had been in the process of being built for 46 years, then we know that it was likely around 26 to 27 AD when this engagement occurred. Then if we calculated that Yeshua was about 30 years old when he started his ministry, we subtract 30 years and find that he was born around 3 BCE. Demonstrating a second witness within the text that Yeshua was born in 3 BCE. Now, people today believe they are much smarter than the people that lived closer to the time of the birth of Yeshua. And as such, they would have you believe that their PhD makes them more of an authority of the truth, even after 2,000 years. Yet, even if we are to believe this, we should not discount those that spoke about this that lived much closer to the time of his life. Of them, the following early church fathers also wrote about and believed that Yeshua was born sometime between 3 BCE and 2 BCE. They include Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Africanus, Hippolytus of Rome, Hippolytus of Thebes, Origen, Eusebius, Epiphanius. If we then return back to the initial premises, we find that premise 1 is more likely to be false than true. Premise 2 is based on historical ignorance after believing that premise 1 is true. In other words, without premise 1 being true, premise 2 would not necessitate that Quirinius was governing Syria prior to 4 BCE, but rather that he could have been governing Syria within a time period that actually makes more sense. Therefore, premise 2 is also a false premise. When these are corrected, it demonstrates that Yeshua could have been born during the lifetime of King Herod, as well as during a census, whether before or during the first term of Quirinius governing Syria, resolving the contradiction and further lining up with other scriptures such as John 2:20 and the writing of several of the early church fathers. Now that this has been established, we can move on to understanding further prophetic literature, which I hope to do in our next video. If you would like me to demonstrate through the scriptures, history, and Jewish tradition when Yeshua was most likely born in 3 BCE, please subscribe, like this video, and let me know in the comments section. Thank you, and be blessed.